what were the original stated objectives of the war in Ukraine from both the Ukrainians and then the Americans, and how it's changed? Because I've heard different things about, defending democracy and then reclaiming Crimea. Can you say exactly what is the stated objective originally and what it is now, both the Ukrainians and the Americans?
Yeah, well, we've actually heard different stories. Often, and this happens in every conflict. It becomes a fight of good against evil, and of course, we're the guys in the white hats. We represent good, and the other side is pure evil, and that's more particularly framed as a fight between democracy and authoritarianism. So that's often how it's portrayed. Recently, Zelensky went to a munitions factory in Pennsylvania, I believe in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he gave a speech like this: "You're defending democracy," and that, again, that's just kind of that's an old theme, going back to World War II or earlier, World War One. That's always been part of the kind of the American military mindset. It's always been the justification for war. It's always the way that popular support is drummed up. So that's always been there from the beginning. But certain people have let it slip, including Lloyd Austin. I think it was in the very early months of the war that what we're trying to do is actually weaken Russia. And I think that's what the elites are looking at. This is the calculation that they made. And, it's generally not the state of, well, no, it often comes out. It's not, it's not really how they speak to the public, but it's just among themselves. And it does appear in elite media again and again. Our objective is to weaken Russia, ideally overthrow Putin. In the most extreme form, which you hear from example, the former, the Estonian prime minister, who is now the new foreign, I don't know quite what her title is, but like the equivalent of the foreign minister for the EU, said we need to break up Russia. We actually need to bring about its collapse and break it up. So just somewhere along this, from weaken to actually break it up, and hopefully to have Putin overthrown in the process.
So that's the American NATO objective, is to weaken.
Right.
But I think
that's it. Yeah, it's clearly not working. So it's now becoming sort of more of like, God, we can't lose. It's like, they were sure that they were going to win and they were going to achieve these objectives. And that's why they went in. That's why they scuttled the talks, the Istanbul Agreement. Why they told Zelensky, pull out of this, cancel this, we're going to defeat Russia. I think they really believed it. Now they're starting to see that I think most of the elites, better than the publics now, understand that this is not going to happen. But then it's now become a new issue. It's like, we've got to save our own skins. This is going to we can't lose. So,
but just that stated objective from the beginning is such an amorphous, ambiguous objective. I mean, to weaken Russia is like, what does it even really mean? Just to hurt them, you're not going to, I don't know, demilitarize them? I'm not exactly sure. It's not a clear objective. Like, when do you know you've achieved that goal?
Just create chaos and hopefully foment, conflict within the government and encourage secessionist movements, within Russia. Again, it seems like they can't give up on thinking about Russia like it was in the 1990s. When it really was falling apart and it could be kicked around, and it didn't matter what Russia, you could just ignore its security interests. And when Russia, said, hey, stop expanding towards us, you just say, give them the finger and continue to expand NATO towards Russia. It seemed like, that's something they can't let go of. They still have that Russia in their minds. A lot of them do. I think it's slowly changing, and they're starting to realize that, okay, this is not going to happen. But at the very least, okay, maybe we're not going to get back all these territories. Maybe Putin's going to remain in power. Maybe Russia's not going to break apart. But at least we can, maybe freeze the conflict where it is and declare victory. You say Russia was going to conquer the whole country, and then amazing Ukraine held them off and only lost, 22% of the country, something like that. And it's a victory for us. I think that's what some of them are starting to think, but it's just a way to really to spin things and to, whatever happens, they don't want it to end in an obvious defeat for NATO. I think that's really what the new objective has become. That the old one was really to weaken and destroy Russia. There's still some who have that idea. Again, like it seems like some of the crazies in the Baltic states. So, one of those is now the EU foreign minister. They still some of them have that idea, but I think more of them are becoming realistic. And their idea is like, basically, we just have to avert an obvious defeat, because that's going to be such a blow to our prestige, as Boris Johnson put it bluntly, it's just, he said, Western hegemony is on the line here. It would be a blow to Western hegemony.
Right. But if you want to not have an obvious defeat, then you should take the route that, J.D. Vance is proposing, where there are some concessions where, these areas like Donetsk, but that's been clear that's a non-negotiable factor. So it seems like Ukraine and NATO are taking kind of a maximalist position. Their idea is that, no, we don't. I mean, Ukraine's even written into law, Zelensky put into law, that we won't negotiate with Russia as long as Putin's in power. So they've kind of painted themselves into a corner here. They have to change their tune if they don't want to have a complete defeat. Do you think that will happen, or they're going to stick to this maximalist position? Yeah,
well, that's the big part of the problem is Zelensky and the Ukraine regime, that they wedded themselves to. They lionized the man. They built him up as the new Churchill. And now they're starting to realize that the guy is deluded and he's not listening to them. And, I think probably, again, the more realistic among them realize that he's trying desperately to bring them into a war against Russia, which, again, the saner among them definitely don't want to happen. But they've got him on their hands. They built him up and they clearly find it hard to say no to him, which seems... Again, it's just sort of ridiculous. Again, this is very analogous to what's happening in Israel. Netanyahu has even more strength, vis-a-vis, obviously, the United States. But Zelensky has his supporters, and, he doesn't have the support that he had a couple years ago, but he still is the Western governments have trouble, after all these visits, and all these hugs and all these photo ops, and they have trouble saying no to him. It seems like, and he's learned that if he keeps on, the one thing that he's good at is PR, that if he can just keep on applying the PR pressure, he generally gets what he wants. And this is ridiculous. You think a great power like the United States, and then, and by extension, NATO, should have a very clear sense of what its own interests are, and should be able to just lay down the law with a state like a very dependent state like Ukraine. But they do seem to be vulnerable to those pressures from them. That's part of the problem. Again, like J.D. Vance, I don't think his was even realistic because it didn't sufficiently take into consideration Russia's own security interests, but it did to some extent, right? He talked about neutrality. And that's a starting point. I think, like, if you brought that up and agreed, okay, let's put neutrality on the table, Russia might at that point really start talking.
They might come to the table at least.
Yeah, they might at least come to the table in that case. But yeah, he shot it down directly. I mean, he specifically pointed to Vance as being, out of line, basically. And again, that's what they have to deal with. They kind of created this monster, this Zelensky and the Ukraine government, that's supposed to be this bastion of freedom. And now they've, which of course it isn't. The whole thing is so absurd. I mean, it's just that, that there's no political opposition. There's no freedom of expression there.
They shut down the church as well.
No, it's actually, becoming a totalitarian regime. I mean, again, it's just sort of white is black and black is white in this.
Right. No elections.
Right.
Well, you were saying that the goal of NATO and the West has changed to where they just can't have an obvious defeat on their hands. So they need to have something where they can at least spin it and say, okay, well, we still saved Ukraine as much as possible and we stopped the Russian horde. But it doesn't seem like if that's their aim, it doesn't make sense, because I'm seeing what's happening in the UK. I also just saw the news that the Danish Prime Minister said that there should be no red lines when it comes to Russia, that we can launch anything. So it doesn't
Yeah.
seem necessarily to be their objective for
Yeah,
most,
no,
for
right,
many politicians.
Yeah, right. I pointed to the Baltic states, but you're right. Also, Denmark, the UK, and you do find it in other countries. Again, it's the U.S. that in the end gets to call the shots, and there clearly are some realists within, I think, in particular, the Defense Department. And that's why, so far anyway, the U.S. has been holding the line on this. And if they do hold the line, it just won't happen. Now, this is Zelensky understands that. That's why he's in the U.S. right now. I think he wants to get this. Again, I don't think he's so deluded to think that it's actually going to make any difference to the war. But, potentially, again, it's just another escalation that could lead to an incident that could, conceivably bring NATO in on his side. And I think that's what he wants. Just like, again, Netanyahu down in Israel is just trying to find a way to bring the U.S. in on its side.
Right. And bringing in NATO, that means World War III when we say that.
Yeah. No.
That's what it
means. Well, we're talking about Israel. It could be a horrific, very dangerous regional war, but it doesn't. That potentially could involve nuclear weapons. So we're talking about something very serious, but it wouldn't necessarily mean World War III. But if we're talking about NATO against Russia, I think that's almost the definition of World War III right there.
Right. It could mean the end of the world.
Could.
And that's our man. That's his plan. That's Zelensky's grand plan.
Well, he doesn't want to end the world, but he's willing to take the world to the brink.
But he wants World War III. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, I think he does. Yeah.
Right. Okay, scary. Well, speaking of nuclear weapons, what is Russia's nuclear doctrine?
Okay, they've talked about revising it recently. I don't know if I don't think they have, at least not officially. They actually do not, as I understand, they do not accept first strike. Using only resort to nuclear weapons like at the very existence of the Russian state is threatened. I imagine like if the NATO armies lay siege to Moscow or something like that they could conceivably use them. Now, on the NATO side, I think they are allowed to use first strike, meaning that, a sort of a surprise attack even before a true conflict breaks out. The Russians, according to their current doctrine, wouldn't do that. It would have to be a conflict that had already broken out, and the very existence of Russia or the Russian state would have to be threatened.
Has that always been our nuclear doctrine, that we allow for first strike?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know how long. It's been
like
that way for a while.
A very aggressive doctrine that everybody has, sort of a doctrine saying as long as you don't mess with us, then everything's fine. Except there's one actor of the U.S. with our nuclear doctrine. We might do it. You don't know. Keep you on edge. It doesn't seem very polite, I should say.
Well, that's a very gentle way of putting it.